we have the luxury of being first. And I explained to the Group 1 breakout session was that the reason we were first is because we were the best of the best, because Margaret, said we were the best of the best, and she was in our group. So, with the exception of Dave Fowler and myself, when we were the rest. Right, Dave?
Correct.
All right, thanks. Anyway, we had a great session. It was nonstop interaction for an hour and a half. We had to stop, at the end just to catch a breath. So it was really a great session. Enjoyed it. We had a tough time trying to get all the notes down, but I'll try to summarize them. We have it on the computer here. We're not going to project it because I think we're still editing in this case, but I'll go over some of the stuff that we were talking about. What is the coastal zone? For the most part, it was hard to distinguish the difference between what's a coastal zone and what the other two questions were, so we kind of ended up going back and forth a little bit. In the end, went back and tried to redefine what a coastal zone is, but I'm going to give you some of the high points and some of the comments that we had in our discussion today. The coastal zone, there was something about, it's a challenge because there is no real definition. Each state sets their own definition, and some are set on title, some are set on defining boundaries. So the fact that there's an absence of that is difficult, because I think we asked, well, what is the definition? Nobody had one. So that's why, it was a good question to ask, and we thought we could go back and try to recover some of that information, but it was apparent that it was a moving target. So, we talked about that for a while. There was a discussion about, you need to look at a coastal zone by breaking into three areas. One suggestion was tidally influenced areas, along with estuaries, along with open coasts. Another suggestion was cultural versus geomorphological versus hydrological. So, if we're looking at definitions of coastal zones, maybe we need to consider those as well. And then there was a comment about perhaps we should define on the region, south, north, western. It really depends on which area, because if you got the west coast, you're talking about a different set of conditions and cause and effects than we are in the Gulf and perhaps on the Atlantic, and then some other parts of the country. So I think that's applicable, because I think those definitions are going to change depending on where we're at and what we're working with. We also had a comment regarding depends on who you are and what you're associated, what you are associated with. Government versus insurance versus regulator. I think we need to look at all those perspectives in order to define what that coastal zone is. Depends on the source of flooding. I know we just talked about that, tsunami versus storm surge versus tides, etc. Somebody had mentioned that that salinity issues are really important, and something needs to be, defined as part of a coastal zone relative to salinity and maybe the regions associated with that. Needs to be a regional-based definition, but also a need to define an event frequency. More to, I'm an engineer. It's a lot easier for me to define that based on, give me a 1% or a 0.5% flooding limit. That's something I can relate to, and there was some talk about that and the need to do that. And then we talked a little bit about, well, how does that relate to ecosystem? And then the comment was made, well, ecosystems are also closely related to those events, in the hydraulics of tides and the hydraulics of storm surges, etc. So maybe we're accomplishing some of the other by going to that extent. And, we talked about that for a little bit. We also had in that coastal zone definition, do we consider both spatial and temporal? And we had a long discussion about that, and I think, Doug, you brought it up, this morning that it was important, and we talked quite a bit about that, and I think temporal becomes very important, not only with, what we're doing today, but what we're doing 20 or 30 years from now as well. So we talked about the importance of including that in the definition. And need to consider saltwater intrusion moving inland and way beyond the coastal zone areas. And I think that, that was a discussion. It's difficult right now to define coastal areas and then how far that impact would be, but perhaps that was a consideration that would enter into the conversation. Then we got into the hazards and threats of greatest concern. It was difficult for us. We were talking about hazards and threats, and then we were moving into risks, and it was hard to not transition one into the other, and so it kind of, we tried to stick to the hazards and threats, and you'll find that we probably moved over a little bit into the other category, but in general, we had a lot of really good conversation in that area. One of the comments was, hazard is a repetitive solution. Hazard is repetitive solutions. The hazard associated with repetitive solutions are increased to a proportionally greater extent following disasters. Meaning, you have a disaster, and all of a sudden we rebuild, and we rebuild higher, and then we have a disaster, and then we rebuild higher, and we feel like that's a hazard and a threat, and we need to kind of determine, what's the end game here? What are we going to build for, and not continue to go on and try to achieve existing standards, higher standards, or whatever, but try to recover from that and try to find a solution towards, what should we be looking at, what should we be designing for. From a real estate perspective, billions of dollars of investment development are the biggest threat. That was a comment. Hazards to life, property, environmental, both natural and built, and economic well-being need to define the ecosystems better. Critical infrastructure was identified as a hazard and a threat of greatest concern. Inland flooding, i.e. surface runoff, along with sea level rise at the community level versus the coastal level, was also a point of concern. Coastal and riverine populations are both important sets of the demographics, the people that we're dealing with, and I think we can't separate one from the other. There will be impacts on the coast that the riverine people are feeling. It certainly comes from some of the associated inland flooding, et cetera, and that was talked about at length within our group. Threats to population includes evacuation, and that is a key hazard. That's, in some respects, another form of temporal, Doug. I mean, we were talking about temporal before, but this is a temporal thing too, and I think we related it to temporal, because how long does it take for people to evacuate? How long will the roads be out of commission? How long will the wastewater systems be down, et cetera? So we have a temporal issue related to that, and that was something that we talked about as far as a hazard and a threat related to the coastal issues. Let's see. We talked about land subsidence. We talked about land instability as threats associated with coastal. It didn't get a lot of attention, but we believe that depending on where you are in the, within the region and in the nation itself, it's going to be a big issue, and we need to address that. Sea level rise. I mean, that's what we're talking a lot about today, and that was talked about as an issue that we need to address. Salinity change. One person mentioned public health that needs to be considered. We're a mobile society. That was talked about at length as well, and the fact that we are mobile, we're finding, we talked about the demographics earlier today about people over 65 and people that or kids that were under 5, et cetera, and are we moving more to the coasts, et cetera? We're a mobile society. Is that a threat? Do we need to make sure that people understand that there's a concern and a threat related to that? The change in demographics in general, people moving to the coast, it's going to continue, and we need to be concerned about that. Institutional constraints. We talked a lot about, there was some really great conversation about this, political constraints. Not that politics ever enters into any of this discussion whatsoever. But we talked about political constraints, municipal boundaries, a number of different things, because it was important to how we're defining the coastal zone, as well as some of the threats that we were experiencing and exhibiting. A comment was made that social equity is a big issue in this particular area, and I think that that's true. Disaster risk reduction and resiliency are important considerations. That was something that was mentioned by more than one speaker. We talked about land use hazards are resulting due to unintended consequences associated with some of the coastal zone flooding, and I think that in general was a comment that everybody agreed to, and it was something we spent a long time talking about as well. Social disruptions are huge. We have to acknowledge the social disruption. There was a lot of talk in our group about, and I'm not sure, I think it was phrased, when you have an open wound, the time to start talking about mitigation, and that isn't then, type of thing. It's long term after it's healed a little bit. And we talked about what the impacts were relative to that, as far as when do you talk about people about planning? When do you talk to people, proactively about planning? It's not when it's happened. It's well before it's happened. If you talk to them about when it, as it happens, certainly the people in the field, they're going to worry about where their next drinking water source is, where their food is, where their bed is, etc. So there's a lot of talk about not reactive planning, but proactive planning, and we need to focus on that. And the way to focus on that is try to identify the risk areas, get out in the field, start having that conversation early and often with those people that are there. We talked a little bit about BRAC and how it was a great example of how to do it right. There was no choice. I think, Nick, you mentioned it this morning about part of the 3 things that you were talking about in the plan. One of them was, we should just buy everybody out, pick it out, and move them back. That's just the way it's going to be. There is no choice. And I think we talked about that and said, we may get to that, and maybe we should have that discussion as it pertains to this. And I think we had a long interaction about that particular thing. But yeah, we discussed that was something that needed to be considered. A really good discussion. We had a bit of conversation about we're great at denying that the threat exists. We create our own vulnerability. Very good discussion in that, it isn't going to happen to me, it's going to happen to you. It's not going to happen to you because it's going to happen to them first, and we're not going to really plan for it until, it happens, type of thing. So we refuse to believe that. I think that we're a part of the problem. And I think that's part of that education thing again. We got to get out there and educate people about this potential risk. I think we had talked about, I don't know how long or how many times it's been where you go to a community and they don't believe that they're at risk, and you can relay hazards to them about a 500-year flood that went right through your community, and they still don't get it. But eventually, and I've been back to these communities where eventually you go back to them and you wear them down a little bit, and then after a while they finally realize, well, it's not that I didn't see that 100-year flood occur, but we did have high water back in '06, and we did have water back in '09, and it was this and that. So they eventually get it. But you talk about repetitive loss. This is repetitive conversation. If you don't have that repeat conversation, I think we lose it. And I think that was a part of what we were trying to say, is you have to get out in front of these people early and often and try to create a mindset that works, because we're really, really good at getting our own way, at getting, in the way. We got to get out of the way. So we think that was an important aspect. One member had mentioned, do we want to use that moment, i.e. post-disaster, when they're extremely vulnerable, to initiate change? Again, we talked about that, and I think we're saying that it's tough to initiate change when they're the most vulnerable. We need to get out there a little bit early. It's tough when they're talking about, where our next meal is going to come from, etc., some of the basic life aspects. Buyout issue. Politics rule most of the time. We just lack the conviction right now to make it happen. And it is a conviction. We talked about tough decisions. What are we going to do when it comes to this? It's a tough decision to make. How do you make that decision? Because you're going to get a lot of flack from a lot of different sectors of the community, a lot of personal property rights, et cetera, that we're dealing with. But I think, as we've found, and I think you had mentioned earlier this morning, that it's a tough decision. I think we're going to have to go down that path at some road in the future. I think one of the risks that we talked about was we're pretty reliant on feds to take care of the public following a disaster. And I think we talked about it this morning. Are we too generous? I think in general, again, I don't know why I keep pointing at you, but it happens. There's a lot of subjects that were brought up that I think we are too generous. I think that's what the consensus was, that I think we need to make sure that we need to understand that concept and maybe try to make some change, and probably change in the future relative to that particular topic. Not that it's going to be easy, because I think that's fraught with a lot of other concerns relative to how people feel, the politics, et cetera. And then we said, we lack the will to remove subsidies. And it was a valid point. I think there was lots of discussion about that. The actual subsidies themselves, certainly, I can't tell you that they aren't benefiting a lot of the community, but at what cost to everybody else. And I think we talked about that, and that we just lack the will, whether it's political will or incentive, et cetera, or not. We lack that, and we need to, you know, first of all, accept it probably, and then move on and try to do something about it. But that's the summary of what we had talked about, and that was a small portion of the hour and a half that we were in there, but some of the details that we had talked about. Now, I mentioned that anybody in our group, have I missed something? I mean, because that was, we're trying to catch it as much as we could, and we were competing with an air conditioner that was going on, so we may not have heard everything. But anybody else that was in that group, did I miss something? Dave?
Yeah, we kind of had that discussion about the NFIP reporting and the federal institutions being a threat, a positive, but also could be a threat to the coastal communities and having good sound language.
Yeah, that's right. Some of the, I think,
Particularly local communities.
right, the local communities, you know, it was difficult with the NFIP and trying to make everything work out given the present, you know, state and regulatory aspects of that. So yeah, we did talk about that as well. Was there something else I missed by any chance? I mean, it was a busy day so far. So if not, that was the summary from Group 1. And I know that there's a lot of the best category in the other groups as well. So we'll let you guys move on from there unless there's any questions. Okay, thanks.